Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Mushfiq Mobarak, an associate professor of economics at the Yale School of Management. He is a development economist with interest in environmental issues and has several ongoing research projects in Bangladesh, India, Malawi, and Brazil. Professor Mobarak conducts field experiments exploring ways to induce people in developing countries to adopt technologies or behaviors that are likely to be welfare improving. Today we talk with him about changing behavior in developing countries. Welcome, Professor Mobarak.
Thank you very much for having me.
You have done quite a bit of research, particularly in Bangladesh. Tell us specifically about the work you've done with clean stoves and getting people to adopt stoves.
The stoves are a good example of what you just introduced as technologies and behaviors that we think people ought to be investing in, but they have not been. So in this case, the vast majority of rural Africans and South Asians burn biomass to cook with on very, very simple stoves. It's 3 stones in Africa. It's usually clay stoves that they make themselves in South Asia.
And are they using wood to burn?
And wood would be the best form of biomass, but not everybody has access to that, especially in South Asia where most of the areas are deforested. And so if you don't have wood, you might burn cow dung, but even cow dung requires cows, which is an expensive asset. So people end up burning anything they find that's cheap, so such as crop refuse or hay, things like this, or even dry leaves and branches that you get in the winter. And the smoke that it produces when you burn these forms of biomass, it has very high concentrations of particulate matter, and PM 2.5, particulate matter less than 2.5 micrometers in diameter, is what we care most about, because the finer the particles, when you breathe it in, it gets lodged deeper in your lungs, makes your lungs irritated and susceptible to bacterial infections, which kills you. And now the World Health Organization claims this is a big problem. It attributes about 22% of all infant mortality to acute respiratory infection, which is related to this indoor air pollution exposure. So people cook 4 or 5 hours a day in an enclosed kitchen. There's a lot of smoke they're breathing in and leads to infections. So now the puzzle here is, given these enormous health consequences, you'd think that people would be interested in purchasing improved cook stoves or non-traditional cook stoves, which address the indoor air pollution exposure, but they have not been. So there have been improved stoves like this around for 25, 30 years that have been developed to be context appropriate, locally appropriate for local fuels and cooking methods. But people have not been investing, and these stoves cost $10 to $20, and so that's the puzzle that we're after.
Okay, so these stoves have been in existence for basically a couple of decades. Are people aware of the health consequences of the stoves? I mean, I think that would be the first obstacle to it.
Sure. So we studied that. So we conduct a series of field experiments where we randomly assign or vary prices of stoves, the information you make available for people, and as well as some other things that I'll go on to describe. And it turns out that even if you're not making a connection between respiratory infection and the stove that you're cooking with, it is the case that these stoves are really unpleasant to work with. So the smoke that it produces burns your eyes. I'm embarrassed to admit it's difficult for me to stay in the kitchen for even 5-10 minutes especially while the fire is being stoked. And there are women who are there for several hours, and the infants they care for who are also in there.
Okay, so it's shocking to me, given the health issues and just the uncomfortable conditions of cooking that way, that they would not convert. I mean, is the price point an issue? What have you found to be the issue? Why are they not adopting this technology?
Sure. So there are several reasons. I think price is a big factor. The traditional method of cooking, which is stoves that people construct for themselves with clay, that's essentially free. People know how to do it. The material is locally available, and it's really difficult to compete with an outside option that's free. Right? So price is definitely an issue. That's one of the key issues. But beyond that, there are some other interesting issues that we need to think about, because it turns out that even when you offer these stoves at very low and highly subsidized prices, even then people are not taking them up. And so why is that?
And why is that? Yes.
So we conduct experiments with men and women separately in order to understand whether there's a gender dimension to this preference. So for example, it's almost exclusively women who are cooking, and therefore this technology, the new technology, is really gender specific. It really benefits the women, and so they may have an interest in investing in stoves. However, if they're not the financial decision maker, they may not be able to act on that interest.
I see.
And so you can have a situation where the preferences within the household across the husbands and wives can actually differ, and that might make uptake very low. So to get at this, so we ran experiments in Bangladesh where in some villages we offered one of two types of stoves for free. So one was a chimney stove. So that's really easy to understand what it does. It just redirects the smoke out of the house. Right? And then another one is a common design across the world, is something like an efficiency stove, which makes the combustion more efficient. It reduces cooking time and fuel consumption, etc. So that one is primarily a budget-saving stove. So the first one, the chimney stove, is a health-saving one, and the second one, a budget-saving one. And so that contrast is what allows us to look at whether or not men and women have different preferences. So in one set of villages, we go in some randomly chosen households, we offer the choice of either a chimney stove, the healthy stove, versus the budget-saving stove for free. And we offer that choice to husbands in some houses, randomly chosen, in wives in other houses. Okay,
and what did you find?
So there we find, when you offer the stove choices for free, it is the case that women express a stronger interest in taking any kind of improved stove, and conditional on taking a stove, they have a stronger preference for the healthier stove.
The chimney one.
Exactly.
Right.
So that's not surprising, given what I just said, that women are the ones who cook, so the problems are more salient for them.
Right.
However, what gets interesting is, in a different set of villages, randomly chosen, we offer that same choice, again, to husbands and wives separately in neighboring households. But this time we start charging for the stove, right? And what we find is, even if you start charging little bits of money, of course, both men and women, their demand comes down because, as I said, price is important. However, the women's demand, which used to be much higher than men, actually falls below men's. So it comes down a lot more, right? So the combination of the two things, of the two villages, helps us learn that while women do have a stronger preference for the stove, when they can express that preference because it's been given for free, when you start charging for the stove, even if you subsidize 80 to 90%, women can't really act on that preference.
And they can't act on it because they don't control the purse strings. Is that correct?
That's right. So budget constraints are an issue, but what you find from this research is that the budget constraint is not at the household level like how we normally think about it. There's actually a separate budget constraint for the woman, which is separate from the men, and their constraint is a lot more stringent, the women's constraints.
Right. Okay, so ultimately, what do you conclude with this?
So this is a very difficult issue now, because you can't, so I consult, for example, with the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, which is trying to distribute 100 million stoves by 2020, trying to get uptake of 100 million stoves. And this is a US State Department-led initiative. Now, I can't really advise the Global Alliance that you should go and market to women, because as it turns out, while they want the stove, they can't really purchase it. They can't make purchases.
So it wouldn't work.
But at the same time, you can't say go and market to men, because they don't even want the technology. So the idea I've come up with,
it's like a catch-22.
Exactly, it's a very difficult problem to solve.
So what did you come up with?
So the idea I've come up with, which we're now trying with a new round of experiments in India, is that we should bundle something that
the men want,
along with the technology that we're trying to get the women to take.
And what do they want?
Yes, that's a $1 million question. What do men want?
Tasty food?
So in this case, I've now partnered with a company called BioLite, which has a new stove design where, and this is a company based out of New York. So in the process of generating heat, their stove design generates tiny amounts of electricity, right? And they've added a USB charger to the side of the stove, right? And so what you can do is bundle, say, the simple USB charger for the, say, Nokia cell phones, the very simple, cheap Nokia cell phones that are common in urban and rural India, right? And the idea is, in villages where electricity acts as a problem, which is still true in a lot of rural India, you could bundle this new attribute, which is a cell phone charging capability. And since it's men who typically carry cell phones, right? When you're in villages where they have a hard time charging their cell phones regularly, or have to go to the town, or have to pay for cell phone charging, this is something that men might care about. And what's interesting, what's clever about this idea is that, you could bundle something else that men want with the stove. I don't know, maybe it's cigarettes that they want, right? So you could just say, here, take a pack of cigarettes with it. But at the same time, men would react to that by saying, look, I could just go buy the cigarettes at the store myself. Why do I need to take a stove with this, right? But what's clever about this idea is that attribute, the cell phone charging capability, cannot be unbundled from the stove. And it's not something that men have easy substitute solutions to.
Right. Okay.
So we're now trying out these experiments in India to see how well that works.
Right. So do you have any inkling as to what will happen from that research? Do you have findings at this point or no?
So the full set of experiments have not yet been done. However, after our piloting, we've learned that a lot of the men actually talk about getting, say, LED lights as opposed to cell phone charging as the key thing that they'd want to charge with the stove. So we're also trying now different variations of what product we'd want to bundle with the stove. So lights may be a more attractive option than cell phones.
I think that the sticking point for me is if you tell the husband, look, your wife and your children have serious health consequences, that is not the driving factor here.
Right. So there's a lot of research and development that suggests that men do make very different choices with money than women do. And that's true across generations as well. So other research that suggests that when women have access to funds, there are a lot better health outcomes and educational outcomes, school enrollment, etc., for children.
Yes.
Right? Whereas men giving money at the hands of men does not lead to the exact same set of outcomes. There's research from South Africa that suggests that when grandmothers get pensions, that leads to better outcomes for their grandchildren. So men and women do spend money differently. I think that's one of the issues. But over here, the other issue in defense of men is it's not necessarily that they don't know or they don't care. It's just that because they're not in the kitchen, the problem is not as salient for them. Right? And they are spending money on other things. And the issue is in these poor environments, in rural areas of developing countries, there are many, many competing interests, competing demands on very scarce funds.
Well, and I was going to actually make that point because we are talking about people who have very, very, they are poor, basically.
Absolutely.
Very, very poor. So,
exactly. So even $10 to $20, that if you get them to spend that money on a stove, they might not have food to cook on the stove. Exactly, right. Or they may not have money to buy textbooks for their children, or being able to access a clinic when they need to.
Right. Okay. Now you've also looked at seasonal migration in Bangladesh during famine season. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So this is actually, the research was done in Bangladesh, but this is, again, a global problem spanning across countries in Africa and Asia.
Okay.
And the issue is that in agrarian areas where people are reliant on agriculture, their income comes during the harvest, as you might expect, which is usually once a year or maybe twice a year.
Right.
So in Bangladesh, it's January, that's when you have the main rice harvest. And the issue is that the pre-harvest season, so after you've planted, let's say in August, and then September to November, which is the pre-harvest season, there's not that much to do. There's a little bit of agricultural work, but during this period, you're just waiting for the crop to grow. And so employment conditions are pretty bad, and therefore wages are also low. There's a lot of workers, not enough jobs to be had.
Right.
And so income is low, but at the same time, unfortunately, that's when the price of rice spikes up, possibly because it's been the longest time since the last harvest from last January, right? And so this combination of high prices, low income leads to much lower caloric intake, which is what leads to a famine. In fact, in Bangladesh and North Bengal, it happens every year, and therefore it has a name. It's called Monga, which roughly translates into a period of high prices. Okay?
Right.
So then you have the seasonal famine that's expected, that happens every year. And why, the puzzle for me was, why can we not solve this? Why are people still sticking in there? And as I said, the problem is global. So in other parts of the world where I work, like in Southern Africa, this period is called the hungry season. People are expected to go hungry. In Indonesia, there's a seasonal famine. It has a different local name, but again, the same issue in eastern islands of Indonesia. So all the government and NGO efforts here were trying to get, trying to help people address the seasonality issue. So for example, they might do targeted microcredit, or they might do food for work programs or subsidized food distribution, which are all pretty expensive things for a poor country to do, a government of a poor country to do. And also, it has this perverse effect of getting people to stick to where jobs are not.
Right.
In order to get these handouts, right? So my idea was, can we complement these government and NGO efforts by allowing people to move to where the jobs are? There's some structural reasons why jobs are not in these agricultural areas. It makes sense that people live there. Come January, there'll be a lot of work, but September, November, it doesn't make sense that people are still there. And other qualitative research suggests that in nearby urban areas where you don't have the same agricultural cycle because it's not an agricultural economy, you do have work available. So, for example, you could go work at construction sites, you could go pull a rickshaw, like provide some transportation services.
Okay, so this is basically a new idea because people have not been doing this, correct?
Yes, so some people, of course, have been migrating. So the new idea here is, and the question that I asked is, why are more people not migrating? And that's what's new about this.
Okay, and what have you found? Why are they not migrating?
Okay, so let me first describe exactly what I did and what their response was, and then we'll come back to this excellent question of why people were not doing it. So the experiments we ran here were, I went to a set of villages. Again, it's a randomized control trial, so some villages randomly chosen. We went and offered the equivalent of about $8.50, conditional on one person from the household migrating. The contract was, you get this $8.50 if one person tries it out. You could go for 3 days, take a little vacation and come back, and that's fine with me. But one person has to try out seasonal migration to look for a job. Right? We weren't offering a job, just $8.50.
You have to go look on your own and look for it.
And it was $8.50 because that would cover the round-trip bus fare to nearby urban areas plus a couple of days of food.
Sure.
The idea is, I'm saying, try it out, and if it doesn't work out, you can come back and you're no worse off because I'm covering the cost.
So there's no negative to them trying it.
Exactly. Right? And the second set of villages, I offered this exact same contract, $8.50, but as a loan rather than a grant. So zero interest loan that has to be paid back once the harvest comes back. Because if you're going to scale this up, we wanted to see, if it works as a loan rather than a grant.
Right, because you can't give everyone $8.50 to
exactly. Then with the same limited budget, we can reach a lot more people doing it as a loan, right? Now, also, the thing is that when you offer people money to migrate, you have to talk to them about migration, why you're doing this. So we offer some general information from surveys we collected. So, for example, these are the cities you could go to, these are the sectors where you can find work, and these are the average wages in those sectors, right? So I wanted to, it's possible that information might have an effect, as you pointed out for the stove case, right? That lack of information might be preventing people from doing this. And so in a third set of villages, I just offered that exact same information using the same script without offering the money. And that allows me to separate out, is it really a failure of information or is it a failure of having enough money for a bus fare?
Right.
And then you have a control group of villages where you're not doing anything, but you collect the same data and track migration to have a comparison point for that year, right? And what you find first is when you provide just information, there's no effect. So in the control area, 35.9% of people migrate. When you provide information, 35.9% of people migrate. So it wasn't that people were uninformed that migration is a possibility. And if you think about it, if a third of households are migrating in your village, you know somebody is going, and therefore you know that it's possible, right? So that's not what's preventing them from doing it, right? But then when you offer loans or grants, that's when it gets interesting. The migration rate jumps to about 58, 59%.
Wow.
So you can induce almost a quarter of the households to try this out, right? And then the second result is, I then track what the effects of migration are. And now that I've randomly induced migration in certain areas, I can track very carefully exactly what the causal effects of migration are. And what you find is, if you are induced to migrate by the program, then your family remaining in the origin, your wife and children, so because it's the adult male who's going, they consume about 600 calories per person per day more, which is a huge effect. It's the difference between 2 meals a day and 3 meals a day during this famine season. And how is this, where does this come from? A lot of it is coming from the fact that the migrant is at the destination and has a job and takes care of himself. And we track people at the destination, and the migrants end up earning on average about $110 during the 2-month period. And
how much is that in comparison to what they normally earn during the harvest season?
Right. So during that's a difficult question to answer because during the harvest season at the origin, the problem is not, earnings, but much more lack of job opportunities.
Okay.
But that 600 calories is really what allows us to say that this is better than staying at home.
Sure, it's significant.
Because we are able to, that 600 calories is off of a comparison to what people staying at home were doing versus what people going
I have
were getting.
a question about the loans. Were some people hesitant to take the loan for fear they would not be able to pay it back?
Definitely. So the take-up rate was slightly lower for the loan than it was for the grant. And the other thing, is that ultimately 80% of the people were able to pay back the loan. And so this is what allows us to learn something about exactly why people were not doing migrating to begin with. So I gave you average effects, $110 on average, but it turns out not everybody was successful, right? The majority of people did find work, and based on the data, we can characterize maybe 75, 80% of people as that they were successful, that this was a sensible thing for them to do, which relates well to this 80% loan repayment rate that I just gave you, right? But for 20% of people, there is this risk that, look, you go somewhere, you don't find a job, then you have to come back empty-handed, right? They were induced to go with our program because we said we'll cover that cost and that discovery phase. So essentially, this then allows us to learn exactly what was going on, right? Although to tell the full story, I should continue telling you the sort of long-term effects of this. So I've said so far that many people are induced to migrate, and when they migrate, they earn quite a bit, and they consume, and their families consume more. And then the next year, 2009, and then 3 years later in 2011. So I went back, and in a subset of villages, I did not repeat the program. I just continued collecting data just to track in the long run what happens here.
Right.
And the striking thing that happened is that in the treatment villages that were induced to migrate with money back in 2008, in 2009 and 2011, people continue to migrate at higher rates than the control villages.
Right, because it was proven to them that they were able to find work.
Exactly. So not everybody went back, but we see who went back. It's exactly related to the people who were successful back in 2008. So just over half the people chose to go back again, and you see that people who were successful chose to go back. And then one other data point that helps us learn what's going on here is that in 2011, we asked the people who went back who their employer was, and for the vast majority of people, they reported that back in 2008, the employer that they met were the ones that they were still working for.
Oh, good.
So the asset that they grew here is a connection to an employer, right? Which is the employer saying, okay, you've now proven yourself that you're a reliable worker, so come back next year and I'll give you the same job, right? And that's what induced them to go back. And so all of these data together helps us build a story as to what was going on. And so as an economist, then we write a model that's inspired by these data points, and the model is as follows. So imagine that I give you a lottery ticket, right? And I say, about 75, 80% of the time, it'll pay off, okay? And when it pays off, you'll get like a 400% return, okay? Would you like that lottery ticket?
Yes.
Yes, it looks like it sounds like a really great deal.
Reasonable, yes.
Right? And so that's the puzzle here. The migration is like a lottery ticket like that. 75 to 80% of the time it pays off. And when it pays off big. Right. And so the puzzle is, why are people not buying that lottery ticket?
Well, here's the thing. Are you giving me the lottery ticket, or am I buying the lottery ticket?
You're buying it.
Okay, it depends on how much that lottery ticket costs. Would be my answer.
Sure. So it costs, in this case, it's $10, right? And so that's actually still a good deal because the cost is low, right? However, now imagine that I'm offering you that.
It's low for me, but I don't know if it would be for the,
exactly.
You know what I mean? The price point will vary depending on who you're talking to.
Right. So imagine now that I offer you that lottery ticket when you're really close to subsistence and your family is under the threat of famine, right? So even though you can make that $10 into $50 with high probability, right? So even for a poor person, that's a pretty attractive deal, because with a very high probability, the 10 becomes 50. But if the $10 does not pay off, that small chance, a 20% chance that it doesn't pay off, then the cost of that happening might be devastating, right? Because you're very close to subsistence, you're barely surviving, and if you're $10 poorer, that might actually put you below subsistence and something devastating happens in your family, right? And so even though it's an attractive option, it's an attractive risk to try out, right? And people should normally be taking advantage of opportunities like that are risky. It's really difficult to make that decision when you're close to subsistence. The issue is that, it's only $10 poorer that you might become, but the utility cost of that might be enormous, might be just devastating.
So now moving forward, how is this going to help the people of Bangladesh, for instance? What are you planning?
So if the story that I just constructed with that it's a little bit of a lottery, but people are very, very risk averse, and as they ought to be, it's the fear of failure that dominates their thinking. If that story is correct, then that actually suggests that the way I ran the program with the grant and the loan was not the right way to run it, right? It suggests that people were not migrating, not because they needed a grant or a loan, but because they needed insurance. It was a fear of failure that was preventing them doing it. Therefore, what I should really be doing, or what government policy really should be about, is covering them for the downside risk, right? So how do I provide insurance? And this is what I ended up going back and doing in 2011. Right?
Okay.
So here, now you offer them, say you offer them $10 for migrating, and you have a new type of contract that says, $10, try out migration. If it works out and everything's good, you need to pay me back $15 to cover the insurance premium. But if it doesn't work out, you don't find a job, then you don't need to pay me back, or you can just pay me back $5, something like that, right? And so that has the characteristic of insurance, because the payoff is dependent on like how good the outcome was, which is exactly how insurance works, right? If a car accident happens, you get a payout. If it doesn't happen, they keep your premium, right? It's the same idea here, right? And so we went back and offered this contract, and it was even more popular. Like when the contract was designed well, it was even more attractive, right? And this is even less expensive for a government policy sort of to implement, just because it's on average this contract will just pay for itself.
There's only like maybe a 20% part of the population who will not be able to find work.
Exactly.
So now is policy being formed around this?
Right. So there are some issues that we have to work out. So for example, you can't really just offer an insurance contract that says you don't need to pay me back if things don't work out, because in that case it won't work out for anybody, right? So instead, the way we do this contract is I say, okay, if there's a lot of rainfall in Bangladesh, there's a lot of flooding risk, as many of your viewers will know, right? So if there's a lot of rainfall and there's a flooding risk, I'll measure that, and if that happens, then you don't need to pay me back. But if it's a normal amount of rainfall, then you do. So since then, so now the research is about to be published, and we've gone through the peer review process, and we think that we have something here, and the results are rigorous and defensible.
It sounds great.
And so now being confident, we go to government and to NGOs, and we try and get scale up for the research. Right? So I'm doing this using multiple avenues. So another hat I wear outside of the Yale professorship is as the lead researcher for a Bangladesh research program funded by DFID, the UK government foreign aid arm.
Okay.
And it's called the International Growth Center, and our mandate there is to create more interaction between policymakers and academics like myself.
And researchers, yeah.
Right, so we invite policymakers, and so I invited the Minister for Food Security and Disaster Management to come to London to hear about this work and then discuss it. Right? So just to seed the idea that in addition to food for work programs or food distribution, you ought to be thinking about migration as another policy response, right? So we've managed to.
And did he embrace that idea?
So I think the government is I wouldn't say yes, because the government is really risk averse. So they want to proceed carefully, and they want to see more data and repetitions of this. And other people in other countries, so for example, AusAid in Indonesia was very convinced by the research, so they're now trying this out in Indonesia. So trying to encourage migration from the eastern islands of Indonesia to Java, which are the employment centers. And a large NGO with whom we worked in Bangladesh, who helped us actually design and implement these contracts. So they've liked the idea, and it has this teaches you something about how to get government and sort of policymakers to respond. When we worked with this large NGO, this project and the research results already had their stamp on it, so they were much more embracing of the concept. So we're now working with them for them to design a migration loan contract. So normally they do this standard microcredit contract where you have to repay every 2 weeks. And when you have to repay every 2 weeks, you can't really leave and migrate because you have to stay back and repay, right? So we're now helping them design a contract, which is going to be a migration loan contract, a small amount, where the repayment period would be 4 months rather than 2 weeks, right? So they have embraced that, and we're now looking for funding to try and scale that up.
Wonderful. Well, you're doing such great work. Thank you for being here with us and sharing it.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your interest in the work.
For more information about Professor Mobarak and his research, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.